This is the story of a woman who escaped a life of suffering and then helped free others from their suffering. Today's story is called Save Yourself to Save the Others.
Season 4 of the story features 8 veteran trailblazers whose sacrifices and service changed the world. The story is brought to you exclusively by Salesforce, the world's #1 customer relationship management platform. More than 150,000 businesses are using Salesforce to blaze their own trails to success. You can learn more by clicking the link in our show notes. And now, on to the story.
Minty peered into the darkness from the bow of the steamboat. As she did, she whispered precise directions back to the captain. She was watching for mines floating along the shore of the river. One by one, she spotted them, waiting to kill a crew and a captain that were careless. The captain guided the steamboat safely to the shore. While he did, 2 other steamboats followed along in their wake. They made it safely because of Minty's leadership. When the boats were safely across and the soldiers on board were ready, she gave the order. Attack. Union soldiers stormed out from the steamboats, and another assault in the heart of the Deep South began. Minty went ashore as the steamboats blared their whistles. She watched as hundreds of slaves sprinted from the undergrowth and onto the steamboats that the Union soldiers had just exited. They carried what little they owned. Some carried gunny sacks with squealing pigs and squawking chickens. One woman ran down the hill with a steaming pot of rice. Children clung to the backs and necks of their parents. Minty smiled with delight as the sound of Union rifles in the distance covered their retreat. A few Confederate soldiers tried to stop the rush, but to no avail. They didn't know the territory as well as Minty did. That night, 750 slaves were freed from the plantations along the river shore. And on that night, Minty made history. She was the only woman to lead an armed assault during the entire Civil War. She did it for many reasons, but one of them was because Minty couldn't help but remember her own days as a slave near the banks of that same river. She remembered the filthy dwellings, long days of hard labor, and the beatings. She remembered her mother standing up to their owner. Her mother had instilled in Minty a strong set of morals and values. The owner had negotiated a deal to sell Minty's younger brother to another plantation owner. Her mother had already lost 3 daughters that way, and she refused to lose another child. So she hid her baby for a month from the owner. Finally, the owner and the buyer had had enough. They stormed toward the slave quarters to take the child. Minty's mother saw them and yelled through the cracks in the door, "You're after my son, but the first man that comes into my house, I'll split his head open." She brandished a hatchet, and the frightened owner backed down. Eventually, he abandoned the sale. The idea of freedom gnawed at Minty. She wasn't sure if it was possible, but she knew her soul would die if she didn't try to find out. In her 20s, Minty saw her chance. All the stars aligned. She had saved enough food, a little bit of money, the owner left on a trip, and the caretaker he left behind fell asleep drunk. She ran all night through a mix of tears and fog, and eventually she came upon a small Quaker town. Quakers were friendly to fugitive slaves, but still Minty was cautious. She approached the door carefully. But before she could even knock, the woman of the house stepped out. The Quaker woman shoved a broom into Minty's hands, scanned the road in both directions, and said, "Sweep our yard like you work for us, and I'll go get you some food." That night, the family hid Minty in the back of a cart and took her to another friendly house in a secret network that led all the way to freedom. A couple of weeks later, after hiding from slave hunters during the day and winding through the shadows of the forest by night, Minty crossed the Pennsylvania state line. Awe, relief, and joy filled her chest, and tears fell from her eyes. Years later, she would look back on that moment and say, "When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. She was a new person. She was free. But there was something inside her that made her restless. It was the thought of her family and friends. She muttered to herself, they should be free, like me. She worked odd jobs and saved money to help her family escape. She felt the call, but she wasn't sure how to go about it. In December of 1850, Minty learned that her niece and two of her children were to be sold at auction. Now was the time. Minty had to help. She made her way to Baltimore, hid with a family there, and sent word to her niece's husband, John. She was standing by to help. John found a way to sneak his wife and children into a canoe, and they took it to meet Minty. When they met her, she led them to safety in Pennsylvania. She felt alive, powerful, and strong. That feeling was indescribable, and she was hooked. She was helping others find their own freedom. Minty began making multiple trips a year to help family members and other slaves who wanted to taste freedom. She poured all of her money and might into the escapes. She learned from each attempt and grew smarter. She traveled in the winter when the days were short and the cold weather kept most people indoors. She would leave on Saturday evenings because newspapers wouldn't post notices about escaped slaves until Monday mornings. She made allies along the way with ministers, Quakers, and other free slaves. Many of them would offer boats, shelter, food, and transport for her missions. Minty carried a revolver for both protection and insurance. On one trip, morale was low. The small group of fugitive slaves was on the road to freedom. But Minty sensed that not all of them were in it for the long haul. One man in particular was giving her trouble. He said, I should go back to the plantation. I had food and clothing there. At least I was warm. She responded, you are not going back. He stood up in defiance and said, you're never going to tell me what to do. I'm going to go back. The calculus of the situation filled Minty's mind. The man stood and started to make his case to the others in their party. Minty sighed. She stood with him and pointed the revolver at his head. You can either go on with us or die. She cocked the hammer back, and the man shut up. Minty couldn't afford to let any of them return. She knew the masters would beat information out of those who did. That risked getting them all killed. The man reluctantly completed the journey to Pennsylvania. Minty became famous for her craft. That led to increased attempts to trap her. But despite it all, Minty was never captured, nor were any of her fugitives. Rumors spread that she was blessed by God. On one of her last missions, she was going to retrieve her aging parents. They had sacrificed so much for her. She needed to do this for them. She succeeded and got them all the way to Canada without incident. Minty knew that the Civil War was key to abolishing slavery. She joined other abolitionists and became a permanent fixture at Port Royal in South Carolina. It was there that she helped fugitive slaves with medical issues and encouraged newly freed slaves to join the Union forces. As a child, she had worked in the fields and forest and marshes of South Carolina. That landscape was like home to her. From her old stomping grounds, she would send vital intelligence back to the Union leaders. It was there that she learned of the sea mines that had been placed along the Combahee River in South Carolina. Once she gained knowledge of where the mines were, she was able to open the way for the attack she led. It was that attack that seized food, supplies, and more importantly, liberated 750 slaves. Along the way, she got a nickname, Moses. And like the Moses of the Bible, she led her people to the Promised Land. But her given name was Armanita Ross. Her family called her Minty. But when she decided to escape, she took on a new name after her mother, Harriet, and she took her husband's last name, Tubman. Harriet Tubman would go on to make 13 rescue missions and help 70 family members and friends escape slavery using the safe houses of the Underground Railroad. Years later, she would say, I was a conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. After the war, Harriet worked various jobs to support her elderly parents. She donated land so that a home could be built to support free slaves that were older and could no longer work. She would go on to pour all of her money into helping relieve the suffering of others. And in the decades following the war, she would take up a new cause and work tirelessly to promote women's suffrage. She showed concern and care for others until the moment she died. Just before her passing of pneumonia in 1913, her last words of prophecy to her family and friends were, "I go to prepare a place for you." Harriet was born into slavery, whippings, and beatings. The world today would say that a person who suffered so much had every right to be selfish, angry, and violent. But Harriet Tubman was different. She didn't let the slave owners dictate her path. She created her own. She held on to her dream of freedom. She realized it and became a trailblazer. Once she found safety for herself, she realized that personal freedom was wonderful. But what was better was helping to get freedom for all. That's her story. What's yours going to be?
Thanks for listening to The Story. If you love this and want more, tap subscribe to make sure you don't ever miss an episode. The Story is brought to you exclusively by Salesforce, the world's #1 customer relationship management platform. More than 150,000 businesses are using Salesforce to blaze their own trails to success. The Story is created by The Mission, a veteran-owned media company and podcast network. We create custom branded podcasts for world-class companies like Salesforce, Twilio, and Katera. To learn more, head over to themission.co and subscribe to our daily newsletter.